what the point of today's talk is. So I appreciate some of you guys have your personal statement deadlines going up, hopefully for medical applications. And today we're just going to talk about some of the main things that what worked for us during our personal statements when we wrote them a while ago. And most of today's presentation is adapted from Brummer, who is now currently a fourth year Cambridge student as well, and just to give him some credit for it as well. So I'll just quickly let everyone introduce themselves. I briefly talked about myself. So should we start with Banu, because Brummer isn't here today?
Hi, I'm Banu. I'm a fourth year at Imperial. I'm just here mostly for the Q&A, so if you have any questions at the end, I'll be happy to answer.
So Devanshi next on the list.
Hi, I'm Devanshi. I'm a second year medical student, and I've also done a degree before. So if anyone has any questions about applying as a graduate, then feel free to ask.
And sorry, if you want to go for it as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Saranya and I'm a second year medical student at Cambridge, and I'm here for the BMAT workshop, which comes after this, and the Q&A.
Thanks, everyone. So as you can see, we've got a good variety of students here today who are from different universities. And so we have different kind of structure and different skill sets that are required for different personal statements. But some of the core things stay the same. So if you have questions tailored to anyone specifically, feel free to ask during the Q&A at the end. And later on, Saranya will be very kind to do a BMAT session as well. So just talk about some of the BMAT questions later on. So just to introduce ourselves first. So we are the Jaffna Medical Faculty of Overseas Alumni's Youth Division. So this is for us youngsters who are medical students. The main committee is for alumni, or in other words, it's previous doctors or medical staff who worked in Jaffna. What the youth forum or what we do is mainly just try and deliver things for yourselves who are students who are trying to get us into medicine. This involves personal statement workshops, BMAT workshops, maybe some mock MMIs, or various other interview things to just try and get to help. Hopefully one day you'll all become medical students, and if so, please come and join us, so you can help others just like we're helping you. And we can try and build a network amongst each other to help each other achieve lots of things, I guess, in the future as well. Just a quick disclaimer to start off with, please don't copy anything word for word. As much as it is, plagiarizing, it's going to actually affect yourselves more than anything. We live in a world of AI now, of course, with things like ChatGPT, etc. If you end up falling for these kind of things, it's just a silly way to not get into medical school before you even started. So please, please, please don't plagiarize. If you're going to use any AI technology to help you write your personal statement, just use it for the structure. Please, please do not use it for the wording itself, as it can screw you over. Cool, so what's the main aims of our workshop today to start with? So the main thing is to understand what makes a good personal statement, to talk about how to talk about your experiences and the different types of experiences that we normally have in them, understand how interviewers can use your personal statement, understand how to make the personal part of personal statement, and finally how to efficiently cut down on personal statement because there is a character limit. So what makes a good personal statement? So the personal statements normally have two major things, which is one, to talk about your drive. In other words, why do you want to study medicine? What kind of things have you done to make yourselves, look like you're keen in medicine? And the other part is normally sustainability. So these are the kind of things such as extracurricular activities, such as music, dance, etc., to try and make you stand out and show what you are as a person. Both of these come together coming into one category, which is to show what you've done. So the personal statement's main goal is to show yourselves off, right? So show what kind of things you've done, to show how you are doing your work experience, show what kind of extracurricular activities you're doing, trying to just see what you're up to. So within the three categories, right, for drive, for example, you're kind of answering some questions. Some things like what makes you love science, what do you do to enjoy, looking after others, what kind of personal examples have you had from your work experiences. In sustainability, some examples are those extracurricular activities I mentioned a second ago, some responsibilities that you might have in caring for someone, maybe a loved one, anything you've developed or any developing skills you've gone, maybe at certain places. And both of these come together with evidence. Anyone can say they're amazing, but you have to back it up. And a lot of the things is all about evidence to show what you've done. For example, I'm a team worker because I've worked in St. John's Ambulance where I had to work in a high pressure environment with a team, right? So your evidence is not only to support what you've done, but it's also a great way to show off what you've done. And we'll go through that in just a second in more detail. So what's the personal part of personal statement? It's about you, right? So everything we discussed today, I appreciate can be used in a generic term, but everyone's experiences should be different. So everyone should have their own things that they've learned, their own kind of experiences on work experience, such as ward, GPs, in shops, keyboards, dancing, whatever it is, right? And we've all learned our own different things, but it kind of boils down to some core skills, but just different ways that we've learned them. So let's talk about the clinical kind of things. So when we talk about clinical parts in our work experience, we want to always do something called reflecting. So what's reflecting, I guess, is what you're kind of thinking to yourself. Reflecting is what you've actually learned. It's okay to be able to go on your trip, you know, let's say you've done something where you've done a work experience at Kingston Hospital on the frailty ward, right? It's great that you've done that for a week, but if you haven't learned something from it, it was actually completely pointless and you haven't achieved anything before going or after going. So what we want to see, I guess, in your personal statement is what you've learned. What have you gained? What kind of skills have you trained yourself? It's a bit like a mini CV, I guess. So a good example here is, this is the kind of example that we're going to follow through the whole time. So we're talking about some of the skills that we learned and what we did on the ward and how we would learn from them. Try and be really specific, right? So this is a great chance for you to show what kind of clinical things that you've been involved in. So instead of being generic, be really specific. I did this. So I was there on a stroke ward. I was there on a dementia ward, you know, like try and get really specific to see what you've done. It's great to talk about patients, right? So talk about your experiences learning from patients. Even now, you know, I'm a final year medical student. Even now, the whole point is to learn from patients, right? All of us have been on placements during our time in medical school. The whole point is that you learn the things in the textbook and then you go apply them in patients in real life to try and see how they present and see how to interact with them and try and make their lives a little bit better. So what we want to do is try and hear what you've talked about, you know, hear what you've learned from patients yourselves during your work experiences. But just something to bear in mind, and I appreciate sometimes it can be forgotten when you're a student before entering medical school, is confidentiality is a massive thing. So please try and avoid using any patient identifiers. And what this means is stuff like names, date of birth, where exactly they're from, what bed number they are, those kind of things. Try and keep it generic and anonymous. In other words, if I was to pick it up and read it, I wouldn't know who I'm talking about. Does that kind of make sense? I hope so. Just try and avoid it. Avoid trying to leak some of the information, basically. Cool. So a second part that we can talk about in our experiences is academic. So academic achievements. I think most people nowadays do something called an extended project qualification. It's normally just a small project on something you like to try and perfect your research and analysis kind of skills. So again, this is great, but the thing that I opened with was most of us do it. So it's about what you've learned, right? So it's completely fine to do your extended project qualification on something crazy, like some sort of new surgical technique or some sort of cancerous technique, cancer treatment that no one's ever heard of. But if you haven't learned any of the soft skills and the main skills, then it was kind of pointless. So again, it comes back to those soft skills. What kind of team working skills and leadership skills have you learned? What kind of researching skills have you learned? How have you learned the different types of research, such as different levels of publication, how they use different websites, different journals? That's the kind of things that we want to talk about, right? Our soft skills, not these kind of niche skills. If you've done any academic work, that's great. So it doesn't have to be something like research in a sense. It's all about learning, right? So if you've gone out of your way to learn something new, just put it in. Just talk about how you like learning, because medicine as a journey as a whole is learning. And I'm sure many consultants will tell you that they're learning every single day, right? So there's no such thing as ending your learning, I guess, in medicine. I guess the last part we talk about is the extracurricular kind of side of things. So it's more like extracurricular and everything else. So extracurricular side of things is really important. I think some of us, what really separates you out, I guess, from everyone else is the kind of things that you do yourselves. It's a personal statement, right? And everyone's kind of journeys of what they do extracurricular tends to be different. So again, talk about everything you do and anything you do. It could be playing the instrument. For example, playing an instrument to a grade 5 enabled me to join symphonies, building performance skills and confidence. And that confidence really helped me to do something like today's personal speaking, so public speaking. So it's always about, I've done X, Y, Z, but what have I learned from it? How have I used that now? And how possibly will I use that in the future in medicine? This is also a great time to talk about the kind of things that you're doing outside of your educational kind of lifestyle. So the kind of things that you do to rest and relax. What kind of things would you bring to the university? What kind of things would you bring to their societies? Because those kind of things are important too. So let's just kind of break down what personal statements are, right? So if you kind of think about it, what's the purpose of a personal statement? To find out about your candidate, right? Find out what they're like as a person. Then you kind of think, what's the point of an interview? It's the same answer, right? It's to find out about the person. So if you've got a personal statement and an interview that do the same thing, why bother with a personal statement? And some universities do take that approach. So some universities with their MMIs who give you places earlier, they don't look at personal statements as much. But those universities who do look at your personal statements, use them, because they're going to use what you've written to ask you some questions. For example, you talked about this disease and problem in your personal statement. Explain it to me. You talked about your responsibilities you had. So tell me some time that you had to overcome some challenges. You talked about this book that you read. What do you think is the most important message behind it? So what's the common theme here? Don't talk about something you don't know anything about in your personal statement is the main thing, right? So remember, everything in your personal statement can be held accountable against you. In other words, it's also a great way to guide your interview. For example, if in your personal statement you talk about your time in a work experience on the Kingston Frailty Ward, then if the person who's interviewing you goes, oh, you talked about your time on the Frailty Ward, tell me more, that's a great way for you to talk about all of the things that you've learned, all of those soft skills we discussed earlier, such as team working, note-taking, clinical skills, those kind of things. So sometimes it's actually really good to use your personal statement to guide the interviewer. Force them to talk about the things or ask you the questions that make you look better. You know, like it's a great way to practice your interviewing as well. But the main thing, remember always, is don't overcomplicate it. Try to avoid using really fancy words and fancy terms. A lot of times what happens is people trying to look exceptionally smart or a little bit more formal than they need to. And hence, when they get to the interview, the personal statement doesn't match the person. And those interview questions really start to, I guess, drop you down rather than help you up. So use it to your advantage. Cool. So the last bit I just kind of wanted to mainly focus on is the importance of being reflective. Remember, the key theme I've kind of discussed today is about learning. So if you haven't had an experience where you've learned something from it, there's no point really it being in the personal statement. So every time you say something, for example, I've done a work experience, I've done piano, I've done a project, what have you learned from it? Always try and remember that in the back of your mind. The kind of key things you want to think about is, are you answering one of their key questions that they could maybe interview you in? Or are you being reflective? Like, have you actually looked back at it and like reflected on what you would do differently or how you would learn from it? What kind of skills have you learned from it, right? Because without that, then it's kind of just talking about a piece of time rather than actually something you've learned about and something that's developed you personally. Sure. So I kind of wanted to do a bit of an interactive exercise now. So I kind of wanted to start off with, I hope that everyone can turn their mic on. Maybe if a few people could, that'd be great. So what I want to do is talk about some of the key skills. So key skills are things that not just in personal statements, but also CVs. So kind of the big buzzwords. For example, one is team working, if that kind of makes sense. So can anyone unmute their mic and tell me a few more key skills? Anyone brave enough? Just to make sure, the rest of the team, you can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, nice. So any other key skills anyone can think of?
Time management.
Time management, absolutely, great. Anything else?
Leadership.
Spot on, great one. Anything else?
Communication.
Absolutely. These are great. Anyone more? Any more?
Research.
Decision making.
Oh, sorry, there's two of you there. So if you want to one at a time, maybe. I think I heard.
Research.
Say that again, sorry.
Research.
Research. Oh, thank you. Next one.
Decision making.
Decision making. Sure, that's great. Yep.
Empathy.
Empathy is a great one. Any more? I think I heard someone say resilience. Did someone say that one?
Problem solving.
Absolutely, that's a great one. Any more? Just try and fill it up. We've got two more definitely in us for sure.
Adaptability.
Adaptability. And I think someone said one more there, but they both said at the same time.
Patience.
Sympathy. We'll do that one. We'll end it. Okay. So we filled out a table. So what? Oh, sorry. Oh, we filled out a table, so it's okay for now. Thank you, though. So what I'm kind of demonstrating here is something called the checklist model. So what this does is it helps us to effectively make sure every single line in our personal statement has value to it. So what I want you to now do is, if anyone's brave enough to tell me one experience which they did team working, but keep it brief, if that makes sense. Just a very short sentence. I'll do the first one. For example, I developed team working skills when I became co-president of Dermatology Society. That's all I wanted to hear from you so far, right? We'll expand on it later, but here we go. So anyone brave enough to talk about a time management a skill they learned, or an experience they used to be able to use that skill? Or it could be any of them. You don't have to start with time management.
For time management, could you say how you have like a lot of extracurricular activities and like juggle them while maintaining like a high performance and all of them?
Absolutely, that's great. But extracurricular activities is kind of a bit broad in the sense of what it is. So maybe if you pick one that you're kind of balancing things with.
Just like maybe piano.
Yeah, that's great. And piano and A levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Great example. Anyone, for example, of a leadership moment they've had?
So I experienced leadership during a event through St. John Ambulance. So we had to manage patients in a short time, and there was a very few people. So yeah.
Absolutely, that's absolutely great. Anyone got one for communication?
Volunteering. Oh, great. Oh.
I think if someone was going to say something, go for it. Any time that you've used your communication skills?
And would you like me to call out the names when two people speak at once?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, if you could, because I can't see the I can't see.
Yeah, I just realized. I think it was Monica who spoke last.
Yeah, if you want to tell me a time that you used your communication skills.
Volunteering at a care home where you have to speak with the residents.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great one. Yep. It's only a few more, guys. Come on. Research. You guys sound like you've done a lot, so there must be a few more. Anyone done an extended qualification project, or does anyone know what that means? An EPQ?
I haven't done an EPQ, but I've done a clinical audit.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. That's amazing. You and I have to do, I'm starting to do coding on this now. Great. Any decision making anyone's made? You can reuse the same thing twice. It actually makes it a little bit better. Anytime where someone's had to make a big decision making. If that's difficult, we can move on to empathy too. If any of the ones left over, anyone got anything, just let me know.
For decision making, would the UCAT be a valid answer, or?
It's a good question. It's very, I don't think that's a good answer because one, most people who are doing the interview would have done the UCAT, so it doesn't really make you look different. Also, decision making in a sense is more about, let's say you've had to make a choice about certain things. For example, you've got £1,000. Do you put it all into, like buying books or buying computers or buying pens, and you can only do one of them, so you kind of made that decision. Probably not a great example. A good work experience kind of example of decision making, because it's quite difficult for you to make those decisions. Is maybe you can talk about, during my time at St. John's Ambulance, I helped make the decisions about which patients we should see first in our little team, I guess, if that kind of makes sense. If it's a difficult one, that's fine. You don't have to cover all the points, right? But does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
But anyone else? Maybe let's move on to empathy for now. I think decision making is a bit difficult at your level. Empathy. Anyone got anything for empathy? This is like a core one, surely. Remember, you can reuse something you've said before.
I mean, coming back to the same St. John thing, I had a little kid who'd fallen over and he hurt his knee, so you'd probably have to go down to his level and talk in a way that he understands and like sort of sync with his feeling because he was really worried. So I guess empathy covers that bit.
Oh, absolutely. You know what? I'm gonna remove patience for listening because it comes to a point that I'm gonna make later. But yeah, that's a great example. Only three more, I promise. That's the last bit of interactivity I'll ask from you guys. So resilience, go on. Any of the last three, resilience, problem solving, or adaptability. Anyone from the JMFOA team want to help them by giving me examples?
If you're thinking of resilience, you want to think of something that you struggled with and that you kept going at and then you finally achieved. So that could be, for example, just looking at the lists we have already, piano, say, I don't know, a certain piece you found really difficult. And then this is quite a basic example, but if it's a certain piece you found really difficult, you stuck to it, you're showing resilience, or anything really that you find.
No, great, that's a great example. So I should go into medical school and see. Any two more examples. Come on, guys. Problem solving, adaptability.
For adaptability, could you say working with like a understaffed team, like for example in the junior doctor strikes? Because I was a pharmacist, so I was working, and it was like you have to change up the way you're working and like cover each other's roles.
Yeah, that's a great example. I'm just trying to think how to phrase that. Adapting to staff changes. We'll put it like that for now. But that is a really good example. It's great that you're doing that kind of work experience too. And just find one more, problem solving. I'm sure someone's come up with some problem solving they've done.
Doing Olympiads.
Yeah, I guess so. So when I'm talking more about the problem solving kind of aspects, it's more about trying to come up with solutions to day-to-day kind of situations. For example, what do you think? Think of something on my feet. The patient. Yeah, a good example would be the patient was struggling to write. Okay, no, the patient had some problems with hearing aids, where they couldn't hear, right? So I was trying to take a history from them, but they couldn't hear what I was saying. So what I did was I wrote on a piece of paper to communicate with them, and then they communicated well with me to tell me what their problems were. Does that kind of make sense? Like you've kind of seen a problem which is easily to adapt and change and solve, and you've come up with a way to come work around it, if that kind of makes sense, rather than the Olympiad, which is more of a kind of questiony paper kind of thing. Does the JMFOA team kind of agree with me on that one, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll call it there. But well, anyway, this is the kind of example that I came up with from, I think, my personal statement from back in the day. So if you notice here, right, these are some really, really good examples, and you guys look like you've done some amazing work experience, probably better than I have. But I've kind of filled in a few of the skills with more than one experience at a time. The reason for that is it comes back, remember, to reflecting. What have I learned? What kind of skills have I picked up? So what I'm going to be doing when I write my personal statement is I'm going to put these all together. So I'm going to use these. I'm going to try and mention all three of these skills and all three of these words that I've learned, all from one line, one kind of paragraph, if that makes sense. And this is what this example here does. So if you see here, during my work experience on a stroke ward, so I've talked about my work experience already. And as you know, that's one of the main things that you guys want to do in your personal statement. I've done work experience, great. I've shown that I'm learning and reflecting. The importance of addressing the patient, not just the disease. A stroke survivor had severe weaknesses in her left arm. This meant that she couldn't brush her own hair, which upset her. The consultant recognized this, so when devising a management plan, the main rehabilitation exercise was to brush her own hair. Such thoughtfulness motivated her to practice and made her feel like she was understood and cared for. This taught me how empathy and effective communication are essential for making a meaningful difference to a patient. So within this one small kind of paragraph, which is about maybe 100 words, 150 words or so, I've talked about my work experience. I've been very specific about what my work experience was. I talked about what I learned from, I kind of detailed in a good outline of what it entailed. I've talked about what I learned from it and what I would do to take forward. And I've also kind of mentioned the soft skills that I learned. So the back to the table we're talking about. Listening to the patient, empathy, and communication skills. All of that was described in a couple of lines, right? So this is going to really help you cut down on the space for the character limit. It's going to really help you kind of get across the main points you want to get to. And it will make sure that every sentence has meaning. So what's this model that I've kind of just used? So this here is called the checklisting model, by the way. You can do this in your own way. You can just write your skills, write your experiences, try and use more than one experience at the same time. So some a lovely young man put these two more kind of work experiences together, right? So if this was your personal statement, I would definitely try and put all of these together and have a little paragraph about your St. John's Ambulance experiences and how you use these soft skills, if that kind of makes sense, right? But the model I kind of used to write this example paragraph is something called the Driscoll's reflective model. So remember, everything's about learning and reflection, right? That's the kind of key theme that I'm going to be ranting on about. It's all about what have I learned from it? What have I reflected on? So you're going to describe an event. In other words, what's my work experience? Are you working in a care home? Are you volunteering, as a pharmacist? Are you shadowing a pharmacist? Are you working on the wards? Are you working in a GP practice? That's all great. What is it? Just outline it. Make sure to make it specific. I was on a stroke ward looking at XYZ patient. Keep it specific. Next, what did you actually do? And explain that event and why it was actually important. It's great to be on the ward, but if you haven't learned something from it, it's useless. So I was on a stroke ward with someone with a severe weakness in their left arm. Being very specific here, this meant she couldn't brush her hair. I'm talking about how the consultant came up with a plan and how she can adapt her rehab to make her life better, right? Which is the main event. What's significant from it? The most important step is now explain how you will use this information to improve your future practice. In other words, improve what you've learned. So in my final line, such thoughtfulness motivated her to practice, make her feel understood. This taught me how empathy and effectiveness communication are essential for making an important decision. Sometimes what you can mention is, in the future, when I, talk to an XYZ patient, I will now devise the same strategy of thinking about the patient's needs directly. What's actually going on with your stroke? What's actually making it difficult? How can I change that for you? Right? This model is what my university in final year, what we use, what we're taught. So I'm going to be entering foundation training next year. We have to write these things called reflective practices, which doctors all the way up to consultancy have to do, right? Write their reflections. This is the kind of model we follow, right? So if it's a model that, clinicians are using throughout their time in medical training, it's a great way to make your personal statement look similar, right? So reflective learning, reflective practice is what we call it. Sure. So I've done a lot of talking about kind of the table methods that I talked about and my kind of reflective model. I'm going to pass it on to Devanshini, who's going to talk about the point evidence explanation link model. This is another great technique that you can use, which you're probably more familiar with from school. So yeah, is that okay, Devanshini?
Yeah, thank you. The model that Vasi just spoke about, I think some of you may also be familiar with the star structure. So that kind of links back to the star structure as well. But I'll go through the Peel model first. So it's very similar to what Vasi just spoke about. So first of all, you start off with the focus of your paragraph. So this is your point. So what are you talking about? So this, if it's about your work experience, you want to briefly outline what your work experience was about. So for example, you did work experience in a cardiology department at the hospital for 1 week. And then you can also mention your skill there. So which kind of skill that you want to talk about in that paragraph. And next, you want to give evidence. So you want to give an example of what you did or what you saw. So, for example, on the right-hand side, you can see that I started off with a point about volunteering at the library, and then I've given an example about how, as a student, I was working there to help the students of different ages with their homework. And for an example, I said that I was helping the students who had deadlines closer and who had more priority topics first. I'll do that more time management example. Once you've done that, you want to link your skills back to what you've learned. So over here, time management skills are important in terms of prioritization. It also helps me in terms of running the homework work. And then finally, you want to link. So when you're linking your skills or your examples, there are 3 ways that you can do this. So you can link it back to your point, which will usually be the situation or example that you spoke about. It can be linking it to medicine. So why is that skill important in medicine? Why is that skill important as a future medical student or a future doctor? I think it's really important that you link it back to medicine, because you are applying it for medicine, or if it was dentistry, you're trying to dentistry. So you want to show that you have developed the skills that are useful for this. So going back to the homework club example, I said that I believe these skills will also help me during my studies as a medical student. So that's a very basic link I've done there, but you could go into a bit more detail and say how that's going to help you as a medical student. So for example, time management skills are quite important for you to manage your workload. You'll also be balancing your work with other things like extracurriculars. Some of you might be working. I know someone mentioned that they're working as pharmacists, so trying to balance their studies and work life. So that's the point evidence explanation link model. It was known as the Peel structure. And as you can see on the right hand side, it also overlaps with the STAR structure, which is situation, task, action, result, and self-reflection. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, if not, happy to move on.
Myself. Sure. So just talk about how to add some more flair to your personal statement, right? How to make it stand out, I guess, make it look okay. So one of the main things is make it easy to read. A lot of the time what happens is it's a bit reverse to how you'd write your essay. So I know we've all done this, right? I don't know how many of you guys have wrote essays at A level, but especially at university, when you write an essay, you try to add as many words as you physically can, try and get to that word limit so that every sentence looks very formal and very full. And do the opposite in your personal statement, right? So you want to try and cut down, keep it concise, get to the point. The people who are reading this aren't going to be reading it for hours on end, right? They're probably going to skim read it, get to the main points, look for those key words that we described earlier. Where's your work experience? What skills have you done? What makes you stand out? What kind of side extracurriculars have you done? Tick, 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 that. So if you make it easier to read and easier for them to understand, making sure the examiner isn't going to get bored or lost during the writing, it'd make your life so much easier, right? So that's the main thing. Be specific is the second one. Try not to be overly broad. For example, I was on the hospital ward. Great. What ward? What did you learn? What skill was it? What did you do on the ward? Like, did you just stand there the whole time? Like, what is the main things that you've done? And it kind of links up to the next thing, which is your personal experience and your unique reflection. So all of us here could be on the ward on a different day, and we could have learned one completely different thing, right? It could be how to communicate amongst each other, how the hierarchy in hospital works, how to communicate with different members of the team, how to communicate with the patient, what different patients' perspectives are. So there's no right or wrong, right? But the main thing is, what have you learned? So I keep bringing on about this reflection thing, because this is genuinely what I have been taught to be used, throughout my medical career. And hopefully, I'm a future doctor as well. It's all about reflective practice and reflective learning. So even if something goes wrong, or if anything's happened, it's all about reflecting from it. What have you learned? How can you, teach others about what's going on? And that's kind of what your personal statement is about too. What kind of experiences have you done? What kind of personal experiences have you had? How have you learned from it? What kind of skills have you picked up from it? You can use medical jargon, that's fine, just use it correctly. The reason I say this is a lot of times what people do is they use very, very fancy words, but they don't quite know what they're using it for. So I'd kind of, think about what you're going into, right? So you're going to try and become a medical student. You're not going to try and become a specialist 1 in 1,000 cancer surgeon, if that kind of makes sense, right? So it's great to talk about how you've learned something about 1 in 1,000 cancer surgeon, but that's not relevant for what you're trying to get into. So it's completely fine to talk about something which a medical student would learn, right? Like, it doesn't have to be some super unique bit of knowledge that no one else has talked about. It's completely fine to be a bit of knowledge that they expect, a second, third, first year medical student to know, and know it well. That's, I think, way better than talking about something completely niche in an interview, because you probably won't be able to know it at a level that the examiner's going to know. It might look a little bit worse and better off. Keep it logical and fluent, right? So tell a story, make everything flow together. Goes a bit to what Devantry said about linking things together. So if you're ending one personal statement paragraph talking about how doctors are tough, having it tough to balance their work-life balance, that's a great way to follow on the next paragraph about how your extracurricular activities, what you're doing to manage your work-life balance in A levels, right? So it's just everything should link together and flow together. It shouldn't feel like 3 random paragraphs put together. It should feel like one is trickling to the next, if that kind of makes sense. I remember it's all about skills, right? So everything you do, try and make sure every sentence has purpose to it. Try and mention the skills that you've learned, whether it be through an extracurricular activity or work experience. I always recommend using the checklist model. That's what I used. I think it's a great way to help you plan. I think everything's always better with a plan, right? You kind of start writing blindly, it kind of doesn't fall well. You can kind of pick these kind of main things that you've done, pick the skills you want to talk about, and help flow through, use your peel if you want, because that's what you're probably used to from your GCSE and your A levels. You're probably used to seeing peel and using it to write your paragraphs. So just to summarize though, just please don't just try and go back to this whole ChatGPT and AI kind of thing. Just please, I know it's really tempting to use them, and I can understand you can use them as a template, but you have to remember that these kind of middle kind of words, if that makes sense, where you join sentences together, would be used identically in people's personal statements. Or structures would look the same if you're using these AIs. So you might actually just look like a robot. I guess that's what it is. And I really don't recommend it. Is my point. But just something to bear in mind, right? Cool. So that's the end of the personal statement part of the workshop. I'm going to pass it on to Saranya to talk about the BMAT workshop, and then right at the end we'll take some questions on both ends. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. So hi everyone, I'm Saranya, and yes, I'm here to talk to you guys about the BMAT. And could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just a quick run through, even though I'm pretty sure all of you know this sort of structure of BMAT by now, but the BMAT is required by 6 medical schools. So these medical schools are Oxford, Cambridge, UCL Imperial, Brighton, and Lancaster. And it's a 2-hour exam with 3 sections, and definitely fewer questions than UCAT. So time does feel like a luxurious thing you have when you do BMAT. So section 1's an hour long, and you have about 2 minutes, just under 2 minutes to do each question. Section 2 is your science, and you've got about a minute to do each question, so science and maths. And then section 3 is your essay. So what I want to do today is run through all of the sections, but what I want to really focus on are sort of the things that will make sure you get your answers, you get more answers correct, and things that you can do to sort of speed up the time it takes you to do these questions. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So section 1, we're looking at critical thinking specifically. When we're doing critical thinking, all of the questions, all 16 questions, are going to be based around a text. And what we want to be able to do when we're reading this text is identify these sort of key points, the key features in an argument. So the features are the main conclusion. So the main message, what's that one thing the author wants you to take away from the text? And I say this, regardless of whether that question is about assumptions or whether it's about flaws, strengthening statements, anything, when you're reading it, at the back of your mind, try and figure out what the main conclusion is. And I say this because at the foundation of every critical thinking question, you have to come back to the conclusion, because the question's always going to be about, is this the correct conclusion? Is this statement going to help the conclusion? Does it support the conclusion? Does it invalidate the conclusion? So a lot of the times, once you've identified the conclusion, you can easily eliminate like 2 or 3 answers at least, just because they're irrelevant to the conclusion. And we'll see that later on. So that's your main thing. And then the next thing you want to look out for are your reasons or supporting statements or premises. So these are just some terms that you may have come across. All 3 mean the same thing. But these are the points that lay the foundation for your conclusion. So if the author is coming up with a conclusion, they must have had something to base it upon. They're not pulling these ideas out of thin air. They would have given some sort of argument before. And these are your supporting statements. And finally, this is slightly trickier, but trying to figure out what the assumptions are. So the assumptions are reasons or supporting statements that are not explicitly said in the passage. And the assumptions that we want to focus on are the ones that support the conclusion. We want to look at the underlying assumptions. So could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So whenever a question is asking about assumptions, you'll notice that they always say underlying assumptions. So what that means is that the BMAT test people want you to identify an assumption that directly links to the conclusion, because within any passage, you will actually realize there are so many different assumptions that have been made. But if they're not linking to why the authors come to this XYZ conclusion, then it's irrelevant. And often identifying assumptions can be fairly tricky. So this is my way of doing it. And I just remembered, I forgot to say, a lot of these slides are also from Brahma, who isn't here today, but he put together these slides and I've just adapted them. Just wanted to throw that out. But yes, going back to assumptions. So this is like a flowchart type thing. So first of all, does the argument, so the main conclusion, depend on to any extent on this statement that you're considering as an assumption to be true? If the answer is yes, then we now know that the statement is either a premise or it's an assumption. If it's a premise, supporting statement, reason, it's explicitly said in the passage. So the author would have said, this thing XYZ happened, therefore this is my conclusion. That is a supporting statement. An assumption, however, is something that's not explicitly stated in the text, but it does influence the conclusion. And obviously, if a statement does not influence the conclusion in any way, shape, or form, then it's not an assumption underlying the argument. We will come back to sort of putting this into practice. I just want to draw your attention to this cartoon train that I've put at the bottom of the slide. Slightly odd way of thinking about it, but to me, this makes a lot of sense. Think about the three carriages, right? You've got the premise, which is the purpley one, assumptions, the green one, and conclusion, the blue. The assumptions that we care about, they're the link between the premise and the conclusion. You cannot get a conclusion from the premise without this assumption. So imagine on a railway track, you take out that middle carriage, and now there's nothing holding the conclusion and the premise together. They're not going to be linked. So what I'm trying to really get to here is that your underlying assumption has to be directly linked to the conclusion. And it's not just for assumptions, whether it's a strengthening statement, weakening statement, flaw, anything, has to directly influence the conclusion. There may be a flaw in the passage or the statement, or maybe there's something wrong with the study they've used, or who knows. But if it doesn't directly influence the conclusion, then that's not going to be the answer. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So there's another concept, argument mapping. And what I'm going to run through what argument mapping is, just to sort of make sure that we all understand how arguments are formed. Because if we understand how arguments are formed, we can then realize what makes an argument stronger. We can realize when an argument hasn't been formed properly. And essentially, we can just do all the critical thinking questions. Can I have the next slide, please? Can you keep clicking until a blue dictionary comes up? Perfect, thank you. So this is your very basic argument, a simple argument. You have one reason, and that directly links to a conclusion. And we can see that the conclusion, which is that I want to buy an Oxford dictionary, is based upon the reasoning because of the link word therefore. And obviously, after 17, 18 years of reading, well, maybe not, like 14, 15 years of reading English, you guys will pick up on this subconsciously. But understanding that the therefore is the reason why the reason R1 is linked to this conclusion means that when you're reading critical thinking passages, you can see why an author has made a conclusion, why the author, which points, which supporting statements the author has used to come to the conclusion. Because if you remember what I said, supporting statements and conclusions are two of the things you want to be identifying subconsciously as you're reading the passage. So this is your simple argument. Obviously, arguments are formed in a slightly more complex way, and we'll look at the next slide, please, which is independent reasoning. That's it. Yeah, thank you. So independent reasoning, having multiple reasons essentially that come together to form the same conclusion. So obviously, having read BMAT passages, you guys will know that the BMAT text is a one-sentence long. It isn't statement A, therefore statement B. There will be multiple things the author talks about, and that some of these things will then come together to form a conclusion. So this is independent reasoning. So here you've got wanting to expand vocabulary and also liking blue things. So therefore wanting to buy an Oxford English dictionary. So if we think about this, the reason I'm highlighting this independent reasoning argument mapping thing is because when you're reading BMAT texts, there'll be so many different things the author has talked about. Like I have read so many texts where the author would have talked about a certain thing, right, for like half the text, but then that entire half of the text is just an introduction to his main point, which is that he doesn't believe in what he's talked about in the first like 3 sentences. But it's identifying that, it's being able to identify these individual reasons that sort of come together to give a conclusion that's important. Just because the author has talked this one specific BMAT passage, the first half of that paragraph was about how internet and social media was introduced to this world as a means of doing good and connecting people, etc., etc. And he spent like the first half of that paragraph talking about the benefits and how amazing it is. But then the last like 2 sentences, he suddenly changes. The author's like, oh, actually, but social media has had quite detrimental impact on democracy because of false news and false information spreading. So as someone in the test, you might have read that 5 like lines and think, okay, thought 3 lines of that is something about the positives of social media. And then something in the answer options will be like, okay, yeah, the author thinks social media is great, but it can have bad effects. But if you looked at the wording of the text properly, you'd realize that that entire first 3 sentences was just a build-up as to what social media was supposed to do, but that's not at all what the main conclusion it's not the main conclusion the author wants you to take away from the text. So that's why I'm saying, understanding that, okay, these 2 reasons are independently sort of supporting the conclusion. But then obviously, if you've had independent reasoning, I'm going to go on to dependent reasoning or joint reasoning, which is on the next slide. Yeah, and this is pretty much your most common type of reasoning, thrown with assumptions thrown in as well. So you'll see how 2 reasons are linked and they come to a third a conclusion, which is your third statement. And if you can sort of mentally map this plan, so it depends. Obviously, there's so many ways you can picture an argument in your head. So I personally just preferred that sort of direct link that I did at the beginning, but I just want to talk about this as well, because this might be something that you prefer. So here you'll see joint reasoning. You'll see how one statement is dependent on the other statement. So the 2 reasons are dependent upon each other, and then they both feed into the conclusion. And the importance of highlighting this sort of dependency is that if, for example, the question is about strengthening or weakening or flaws, which is all about the interlinking of different reasons, now that you know these 2 reasons are interlinked, if you strengthen one of the statements, you know you will probably strengthen the other statement and then will improve the conclusion. So for example, right now we've got R1 and R2. But what if I provided you, for example, you could have a strengthening statement question and the correct answer could be, well, we know that dictionaries are an amazing tool to expand vocabulary, as they've said in the text. But a strengthening statement could be that Oxford English dictionaries are the best dictionaries out there. They are world ranked #1. So that would be a strengthening statement because it's directly influencing reason 2, which is linked to reason 1, and both of them feed into the conclusion. So that answer options probably does best express the statement that most strengthens the argument. But like I said, assumptions are always there. That, well, I don't want to say always, but they're there a lot of the time. So if we look at the next slide, please. And can you just keep clicking until you have a green box? And yeah, thank you. I don't know if any of you noticed at the beginning, but before I said that because I want to expand my vocabulary and because I like blue things, I want to buy an Oxford dictionary. But then you really have to question everything the author says when it's an assumption question. Because if you did question, you'd realize no one ever said that the Oxford English Dictionary is blue. And like the UCAT, just to highlight, you can't bring in sort of own knowledge like this into the exam. So the fact that the Oxford English Dictionary is blue is an assumption, and it's sort of like a joint reasoning type thing with reason 2. Because reason 2 is dependent upon this assumption, if we think about our train, reason 2 would be our premise or our supporting statement, the purple bit. The Oxford English Dictionary being blue would be our green bit, our assumption. And then the front carriage section would be your conclusion. So without this assumption, you can't actually directly make the link that you should buy an Oxford English Dictionary because you like blue things. I hope that makes sense. We're going to do some questions and we'll see how that goes. Could we have the next slide, please? So just to run through what I've said, remember, identify the main conclusion, identify the assumptions, identify the supporting statements. And this stuff I've already said, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but just highlighting that you do have two types of identifying conclusion questions. The first one is the main conclusion. So like I said, that's the thing the author wants you to take away from the passage, the one absolute thing, their final statement, sign off line, whatever you want to call it, that is your main conclusion. Your main conclusion, you want to be fairly broad, you know. Generally, main conclusions will have, sometimes you'll see two answer options which are extremely similar, but they might even have the same wording, but one is slightly longer because they've taken into account a broader aspect. I'm not just saying because an answer option is broader or longer that it's the correct one. I'm saying that your main conclusion has to fairly correctly and fairly accurately represent the overall view of the passage, but it must include the one thing that the author wants you to take away from it. A conclusion, however, is something that is true. It's just a fact that can be inferred from the text without making any assumptions and is totally wholly supported by the information in the passage. Okay. Can we go on to 2 slides forward, please? Yeah, thank you. So if you guys just want to have a quick read of this question, maybe like 30 seconds to read it. And then what I want to do, I'll try and make this interactive. I'm going to ask someone to highlight to me the conclusion. And I'll just ask you guys if you're happy to do so, to put your hands up if that's an option. And then I'll just pick the first hands up that I see. So we're trying to identify the main conclusion of this passage. And like, honestly, don't worry if you're not sure. Like, these things do come with practice, and it's absolutely fine to say something that's not entirely correct. Anyone? If not, it's fine. We do have one more question. Oh, Madhav, yes. Thank you very much. Do you want to tell me what you think the main conclusion of this passage is?
So I'd say it's about how a regular intake of chocolate could reduce the risks of developing any brain diseases. Yeah, so I pretty much agree. Apart from, I changed any brain diseases to Alzheimer's, because if you look at the first sentence, it says a daily dose of chocolate could be the key to preventing Alzheimer's disease. That sentence is pretty much your main conclusion, and the rest of the paragraph is like the supporting statements for that conclusion. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So you can see here, I've put like this flow chart. So we can see that the blue, which is our conclusion, daily chocolate will keep the brain healthy and prevent Alzheimer's. And the main premise, the reason why the author came to this conclusion. So I've highlighted it in the text. So if you see, look at the purple highlighting, you see that the author said something about how they saw a study and these volunteers drank 2 cups of hot chocolate and their memory improved and their blood flow improved, right? So I've got this thing, and now there's an assumption in the middle. There's this green thing in the middle. How can the author, what assumption has the author made to go from the purple box to the blue box? And if you read the answer options, to do this question, if you have correctly identified your purple and blue boxes, literally just slotting in these
each of the answer options into that middle section and then trying to read it through as a logical process, it'll be really obvious which one the assumption is. So for example, if I take E, no, not option E, that's the correct answer. If I take option D as an option I think could be correct, I'll read it out loud. So daily hot chocolate has shown to improve memory and thinking skills. But if regular amounts of chocolate are consumed over time, other health problems could arise. Therefore, daily chocolate will keep the brain healthy and prevent Alzheimer's. Honestly, that makes no sense to me because chocolate causing other problems and then completely irrelevant to you should eat chocolate to prevent Alzheimer's. However, if you put answer option E in, you'll see that the assumption that the author has made is that just because general brain function has improved from this hot chocolate consumption doesn't mean that we're going to prevent Alzheimer's, or at least, we're going to prevent Alzheimer's. And this is because, for example, just think about this in a hypothetical scenario. What if it was that Alzheimer's is completely unrelated to brain health, and it's actually more to do with, I have no idea, I've only done 1 year of medicine, so I really can't think of any examples, but maybe it could be that Alzheimer's, nothing to do with your memory, but something to do with protein levels in the blood. Who knows? Something really, really random and irrelevant. So the author has clearly made the assumption that brain health and like memory and blood flow are directly linked to Alzheimer's, but that's not something we know, and it's not something that's said in the text. Hope that makes sense. If we go to the next slide, just one more slide, yeah. So if we look at this question, again, you guys can give it a try. And if someone wants to put their hand up once they realize what the conclusion is, that would be great. Or it doesn't, if someone could also tell me what the premise is, that, or the supporting statements, like what goes in the purple box, that would be awesome. And then we can just work through this question together. Okay, I'm just going to move on just because I'm slightly wary of time. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as you can see here, I've highlighted the bits of the text that I think are relevant. So first of all, main conclusion. Main conclusion is that saying only a fool breaks the 2-second rule and then passing the reference point after saying this means that you're not going to crash into the car in front, even if it breaks suddenly. And, you know, the premises is sort of like interwoven, but the premises are the 2-second rules and saying it, and then now you're going to not crash into the car in front of you. So then there's clearly an assumption that's been made. And if we try slotting in each of the answer options into the green box, and we'll try and see if any of them make sense. So 2-second rule, and then adopting the 2-second rule will avoid all accidents. Therefore, you're going to avoid crashing into the car in front. Well, honestly, option A, I wouldn't even try slotting it in because I know, having identified the main conclusion, that option A is quite irrelevant because A talks about avoiding all accidents. The main conclusion here is talking about avoiding crashing into the car in front if it breaks suddenly. Very niche type of accident as opposed to, yep, saying this rule and now you're going to be completely safe on the road. So A is clearly wrong. If we look at option B, most crashes are caused by cars running into the car in front. Again, having read the text, and now I've got my reasons in my head and the conclusion in my head, I know that at no point do they ever talk about the proportions of what types of crashes are caused by what types of cars running into where and whatnot. So the fact that most car crashes are caused by cars running into the car in front is irrelevant, because this text is talking about how we can just, in general, avoid crashing into the car in front. It does not care whether this is that 99% of car crashes are caused by this, or whether it's only 0.1% of car crashes that involve a car running into the car in front. It just cares about stopping these accidents regardless of the number of them. If we look at option C, those who do not use the rule do not value road safety. So we've gone from use the 2-second rule to if you don't use it, you don't value road safety, to now we're going to avoid all crashes. Again, that doesn't really make any sense. And honestly, I wouldn't even slot it in, because I know, again, reading that passage, they don't really talk about the values of road safety at all. All the text really cares about, all the author wants you to take away from this passage, is that saying this rule and adjusting your distance based upon it will enable you to avoid crashing into the car in front. Now we've got option E. Some drivers brake more suddenly than others. But again, if you've identified the main conclusion correctly, the author is saying that this rule is it's foolproof. It's regardless of how sudden a driver in front of you brakes, as long as you've followed the rule, you're going to avoid crashing. So this rule doesn't really, it's not really in line. Option D isn't in line with what the conclusion is saying. Option E, it will not take less than 2 seconds to repeat the saying. So let's think about that. Is that an assumption the author's made? And I would say yes, because it directly links the premise to the conclusion. Because if it does take you less than 2 seconds to repeat the saying, what's going to happen is that you'll say it, but because it's taken you so little time to say it, you will still pass your reference point after having said it. But in reality, for all we know, that reference point still isn't a safe enough distance for you to be driving behind the car. So as you can see, once you've identified the blue and purple boxes, literally only one of those options even links the two things together. So that's a really, really quick way of just eliminating A, B, C, and D, and then just knowing your answer is E and then moving on. So can I go to the next slide? Actually, can we just next slide, because I've talked about this. Yeah, that's it. So that's critical thinking. And with problem solving, I don't want to run through questions. I'm just going to talk about tips because I'm quite wary of the time. But I wanted to go through critical thinking quite well because questions really do help for that. So problem solving, so your question types, you have calculations, deductive reasoning, and logic puzzles, and spatial reasoning. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, cubes and nets, ever since 11 plus, that thing tortured me. I hated spatial reasoning. But there are definitely ways to sort of overcome the barriers of spatial reasoning, and I'll talk about this very soon. But first of all, problem solving, read the question fully. Honestly, take your time. You've got 2 whole minutes to answer these questions. So once you get a good overview of what the question's asking, if it's a calculation question, then you can sort of figure out what calculations you need to do, make sure you're not missing out any key information. If it's deductive reasoning, obviously, you need to make sure you read the whole question carefully. For calculation questions and maths questions, I should say, scan your answer options, right? If you're scanning your answer options and they're all numbers and they are all very far apart, you can be quite lax with the rounding and you can do calculations really, really quickly because you don't have a calculator. So if your answers are like 5, 50, 150, and 340, those answers are so far apart, you can easily round to the nearest 10 or 20, even 30 with the data in the text, and you will probably get the correct answer. Another thing to look for with numbers is scanning the last digits. So say you're doing something that's just like those really long questions where they give you like 10 different ingredients and ask you to work out ratios or something. So the calculation itself is just division, or it's just multiplication, addition, subtraction, but it's long. If you see that all the last digits are different, just work with the last digits, right? So add the last digit of each of the numbers, and then you can easily work out what the correct answer is, as opposed to working with those 3 or 4 digit numbers they give you in the exam. Or if you are tight for time and you notice that, actually, you know what, 2 of these have one ended in the same digit, 3 of them ended the other digit, at least if you don't have enough time, you'll at least cut down the number of wrong options you're going to choose from. In terms of cubes, get familiar with the 11 nets of cubes, just so you understand how they fold. So there are 11 standard nets. If you know how they all fold, then you can quite quickly figure out that, okay, this face will be next to this face, that's like 3 spaces away, as opposed to trying to mentally fold it in your head in the exam. And be very methodical with your working. So can I go 3 slides forward, please? Yeah, thank you. So thank you. If we just look at this question, I'm not going to do it, obviously, but you can see it's a long question. It's all about sort of permutations and combinations. It's all of this kind of questions you get when you do like Maths Challenge, UKMT. So for something like this, and again, you can see the answer options are very close. So it's not something like you can get a rough idea of how many options and then just go to the closest one. You kind of do need to figure out the correct number of options. So if you just quickly read through, the whole point of it is you're trying to work out different sets of numbers and letters. So if we see the next slide, please. I don't know how legible that is. My handwriting isn't great, but what I'm trying to highlight is I've split it up. So I've split up the question into the answer options that use 4 numbers and letters, then use 3 numbers and letters, 2 numbers and letters. And the whole point is that I'm making sure that I methodically work through every single thing. Very easily in BMAT, it's like, okay, you read the question, you're in a time, and you just go for it. Taking an extra 30 seconds or 20 seconds to think about how you're going to answer the question will save you a lot of time in the long run, especially when you're practicing, because taking the time to understand how to do questions correctly, methodically, using the correct technique, means that over time you can build up the speed needed. Going straight into speed now is not an effective way because you won't make improvements in your accuracy. Can I look at the next slide, please? So for these sort of questions, I'm not going to do it again, but what you always want to do is don't fold the whole cube in your head mentally and then try and rotate the cube to figure out which of the cubes that they've shown it doesn't come from the net. What you want to do is you want to work with the face that is facing you. And obviously for each of these answer options, it's a different thing. But if I look at cube number 1 and I see a white square, I identify that on the sort of stem image. And I look at the faces that are next to it. I could not care less about the black square because I know that's not going to come very close to the cube anyways. But that's what I'm saying. If you get used to the cube nets at home, then you know exactly which faces will fold up to be next to the other faces. You can really quickly just skim through these questions and realize, oh, right, when I look at, for example, cube number 3, I see a white circle and a black square, but I know that actually the shapes are the wrong way around. The white circle should be on the other side. Things like that. Just focusing on those 3 faces, forget about the other 3, will make it a lot quicker to answer the questions. Could I skip over the next slide and go to the slide after, please? Thank you. So section 2, don't want to spend too long because I think this is the sort of most straightforward one when it comes to doing and revising. But just a few things to be aware of. BMAT's testing your application of principles as opposed to raw knowledge. So I know I'm like this myself 100%. I love to go through content and then I do questions. And if you're doing that now, I say stop. I'll definitely stop and go straight to questions because you'll realize a lot of it will come back to you, especially if you're doing some combination of biochem, maths, physics, A-level. You don't need to worry about content. And if there is like one question you can't answer because it's pure content, that's absolutely fine. Because if you spend the time working on how to improve speed and identify the key sort of factors in questions, I'll save you and you'll do multiple questions correctly. And definitely the more practice papers you do, the more you realize what things come up more frequently. So very obvious one, electricity circuits, they'll give you some voltages, resistances, and currents, and like work out one of them. Biology, you'll pretty much always have like those family tree diagrams, like genetic inheritance. You'll also have some questions like ecosystem questions, pretty much the same content every year. So making sure you get through as many past papers as you can effectively, understanding what mistakes you've made will make sure you'll really easily identify the questions in the actual thing. So just some random facts you need to remember: your indices. So you can see in the top right-hand corner, giga, mega, kilo, all of that stuff. Physics equations, obviously something you need to know. Chemical tests. I would definitely learn this to be safe because I had not been expecting it for my BMAT, and then I went in and had about 3 or 4 questions on chemical tests, and I was really lucky because I just decided to memorize them the day before. Those are easy marks, right? Stuff like that. I won't do questions here because I don't think it's a worthwhile use of time. Can we just skip a few slides until it says section 3 essay? Thank you. So your essay is one side of A4, it's 30 minutes long to read the options, choose your options, plan which one, and then write an essay. So you pick one question from 3 choices, as I'm sure you're aware, and keep it simple. However simple you make your personal statement, your essay has to be 10 times simpler, okay? It's a piece of writing you're doing in half an hour from scratch. So if we're talking structure, you want an introduction, main body, conclusion. That's it. In your introduction, we define the key terms. Always define what the question is saying. That is literally your introduction. You don't need to worry about anything else. You will also probably give an overview as to which way you're arguing. So if it's a persuasive thing, or do you agree in X, Y, Z, then you'll be like, this is what the statement says, and I will argue that I believe in X, Y, Z. Keep it really, really simple, and it doesn't have to be more than a couple sentences. Conclusion, you summarize your arguments. Do not introduce any new key points. Even if at GCSE English or whatever, last time you wrote like proper essays and you were like, maybe leave the reader with a thought to think about. You're not doing that in BMAT essays. BMAT essays, you summarize your argument concisely, make sure your points are all there, and then you just leave it at that. In your main body, you have a for and against. You have at least 2 strong points for each, okay? So I know our standard is 3. If you think about writing 6 points well in half an hour, that's not going to happen. So 2 strong points. So strong points means you have a very simple PEE paragraph structure. Point, evidence, explanation. Evidence, just to be clear, does not mean you need to have statistics off the top of your head. It can be a completely hypothetical scenario. So we'll come on to some examples later, but you can just make up a patient scenario and say, for example, if a patient were to walk in with this disease, it doesn't mean that XYZ should happen, depending on what the question is. Obviously, it's great if you've done your wider reading and you've realized, oh, wow, yes, this ethical case really ties in perfectly with this point I'm making. So bring that in. Do show them that you have this wider reading knowledge. That's also very well appreciated. Clear, simple sentences, okay? You have a sentence. I waffle a lot, okay? I write in clauses. My sentences can literally be 3 or 4 lines long. We don't want to do that. If you're like me, stop, okay? Keep your sentences really simple. 2 or 3 clauses, absolute maximum. No flowery languages. Keep it really, really straightforward because you want your argument to flow nicely. You don't want to mess up a short argument with words, like fancy words that take up about half the space. Yeah, so if we just plan, can we go to the next slide, please? So you might have seen this question. It's on the BMAT mark scheme. And if I read through the question, it's, in the age of modern healthcare, every time a patient dies after a routine operation or procedure, it's a case of medical error. Explain the reasoning behind the statement. Argue that there can be reasons other than medical error behind such deaths. To what extent do you agree with the statement? So just to make sure, just to really clarify, this question does say, explain the reasoning and argue against, and to what extent do you agree? The questions pretty much will always say argue for or argue against. That doesn't mean you ignore the other side. You still need to give a for and against and give a balanced argument and then form your own opinion at the end. So I'm just going to run through how we planned this, and then hopefully we can move on to the Q&A. So can we see the next slide, please? Thank you. So what did I say? Introduction, we explain what the statement is. You identify any key terms. Okay, so if I'm reading this, forget what's on the page. First, I say modern healthcare, right? And the argument's like, okay, because it's modern healthcare, it should be medical error. So I was like, okay, what is modern healthcare? What does that mean in this context? Defining the terms means that your argument is you're making it very clear to the author why you're arguing what you're arguing. If you don't explain what modern healthcare means, and then you make a point later on with this idea of modern healthcare, as a reader, the examiner can easily rebut what you've said. But if you've at the beginning said, this is what I mean by modern healthcare, this is my definition that I'm going to be referring back to throughout my entire essay, and then you stick to this train of thought, it's going to be very hard for the author to go, well, that's a very weak argument, because you've directly linked it to what you mean. So modern healthcare, we're going to be talking about technological advances. We're going to be talking about, I don't know, peer-reviewed, like really strong research community. There's so many different things that you could sort of take your perspective on. So if we look at this, so we say, with contemporary medical advances, dying after surgery or medical practice with a predictable outcome must be human error. So it's talking about modern healthcare. We've got really, you could talk about technology and how, I don't know, some new instruments are being used, and they're used because of the really, really high accuracy. Or you're talking about modern healthcare being, because you've got easy scientific communication, how doctors at the top of their fields have all been working together to cultivate this new procedure. And because it's been worked on by the top doctors in this field, there's really no chance that it can go wrong, something like that. But then you argue for this, better technology, etc. Then you argue against. You argue that, well, actually, every patient is different. If you can show some sort of understanding of NHS core values, I'm not saying that is your focus, it absolutely isn't. The essay is here because they want to see that you can logically form an argument, you can logically counteract your own thinking and then form a conclusion. That is the main point. But if you can bring in things like, well, obviously an NHS core value is that every patient, a patient is at the center of your care. Well, this is because patients are all different and every patient needs something different. So you can't argue that a procedure, just because it's worked 1,000 times, is going to work on the 1,001st time, something like that. And then your conclusion, okay? Your conclusion, very simple, like I said, just put forward the points you've made. So it just has to be a really brief thing. You don't need to talk about every single point you've made in each paragraph. You'll just say, despite technology being so advanced and having such a wide scientific community working on medical treatments, I believe that we cannot assume that every time a patient dies after a routine operation or procedure, it's a case of medical error, because of the fact that every single patient is different and they all respond to treatments differently, etc., etc. Make it quite simple, brief, and I'm saying this again and again, but please keep it simple. Again, you are writing this, so I don't have any personal experience of writing essays because my BMAT was online. So I had the luxury of being able to edit it. So making sure that you plan your essay, take a solid 5 minutes, make that plan as detailed as you can. Do that from now. Now, every day, find an essay, plan it, at least one or two. If you think about it, that's like 20 minutes of your time max. That's not a lot of time in a day. Getting used to planning essays well will help you so much in the long run. And if we just skip to the last slide, yeah, that's it. Exam prep. So last few things. Regular practice, okay? If you've just been doing content, well done for doing it, but go straight into practice now. One thing I say to everyone, keep a note of the mistakes you make. And I know a lot of you do that already, but if you've got a notebook of concepts that you find difficult, mistakes you made. This is the thing you're going to be reviewing, first of all, daily. And then second of all, this is the thing you're going to be looking at before your exam, like the day before. Because there's no point looking at these maths equations that you know already. But there is some point looking at this concept of electricity that you find really difficult, because that's the thing that won't stick. Obviously, don't overwhelm yourself. Regardless of what happens, your health is the most important. Day before exam, you know, very sort of admin related things, your candidate number, pencils, pens, water bottle, light practice. Okay, keep your brain fresh, don't make it tired. Sort out travel arrangements. Obviously, public transport strikes happening left, right, and center. If you want to get dropped off to school, all of that usual admin. But apart from that, stay calm, believe in yourself, because you guys have worked so hard to get to here. And I think BMAT's probably like the last big hurdle you need to get over, because after that interview prep will be a lot more chill. And I hope this was helpful, and yeah, good luck.